Thessalonians, who are alert in the day, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and hope of salvation as a helmet. And Peter echoes this: be clear-minded and self-controlled so you can pray. There is a purpose to self-control as well, so that we can pray for us, but also for others. Self-control is also not just a New Testament value, it's in the Old Testament. It says in Proverbs 25, a man or a woman without self-control is like a city that's broken into and left without walls. Now, sometimes these metaphors can be a bit elusive. A city without walls. Where's the walls of Vancouver? I just want to get it onto the ground for you. I think really what he means is self-control is like a person without any brake pad in their life. They don't know how to put the stop on. Now again, just so you can see the context, there are places where all of us are weak with self-control. Let me give you some examples. When you're tired and feeling irritable, it's hard to exercise self-control. When you're feeling stressed, it's hard to exercise self-control. When you have been disrespected, it's very hard to exercise self-control. And when somebody criticizes you, how do you feel? Do you feel like exercising self-control? Just say, oh, well, you're entitled to your point of view, but God loves me. Sometimes it hurts. And so we struggle as to whether we're going to respond. And if the person said something that felt mean, then you might go joust back. And now we have escalation going on. Right? Is any of this making sense? My job is to just try and bring this down so it's just practical and you can see why the Bible again speaks to real life, okay? Lastly, in the book of Acts, and I love this one, Paul gets the privilege to speak to Governor Felix. This man is the head honcho. He is in charge. Paul's actually in prison. But he gives Paul, I'm interested to hear what this man has to say. He seems to be an interesting individual. So he gives Paul the right to speak to him. Paul chooses 3 topics to speak to Felix. What do you think they might be? I would have thought it might have been the positives like love, mercy, compassion. Instead, Paul heads off and wants to speak to Felix about righteousness, doing the right thing. Number 2, that there's a judgment to come. And by the way, in case I haven't made my case clear, my 3rd topic is self-control. Now imagine you just got an audience with our new mayor in Vancouver, invited you to come and speak to him. And Mayor, I'd like to speak to you about self-control. It's not exactly a popular topic, but it's important because human behavior needs it. It needed it in Paul's time. It needed it with the governor. And it needs it with our own mayor in Vancouver. Now some of you, humanly, will just kind of push back a bit. This is natural, and say, well, it's not very poetic, or this is lacking some pizzazz. It feels a bit rigid, or maybe it goes against the grain of my need for self-expression. What about my human rights then? But I want to focus this a little bit differently, because it's not about my needs first or your needs first. A lot of the time, learning to follow Christ is about being asked to consider others' needs first. Even in our confession time, if you go back to that wonderful line at the end of the confession, we confess that we have so often done what? Put my needs, my interests first. And by the way, I just want to say I'm very talented in this regard myself. So I'm in the same boat with you all. This week, I was listening to a podcast by the wonderful author and preacher Tim Keller. Are you familiar with this man? He just passed away of cancer at 72 this week, and I was listening to a podcast of his on self-control, ironically 2 days before he passed away. Tim Keller is an amazing person who was a giant of the faith. One of his books I can't recommend enough. He said in this podcast, self-control is ultimately a matter of the heart. It's not just kind of using willpower or say no. Why don't you say no more often? And then, mustering that willpower. He's saying the problem is that because so many people live with themselves at the center of all life, as the center of reality, it's sort of like the narcissism created by that. We're shooting ourselves in the foot. If you live at the center of life and you're the center of all life, you've lost the battle. You and I have lost the battle to basically restrain ourselves a long time ago. Why? Because our needs and my desires and my interests are at the center of all things. And the only way that we begin to learn is by putting others' needs first. Now, if that sounds a bit challenging, well, yes it is. But you and I are up against a lot in the day and age we live in. Let me give you some other examples of self-control you may have experienced recently. You can say something inflammatory in one sentence on an email or social media. Have you ever been on the end of one of those emails? That curt, short statement on an email. How did you respond? Whoa, talk to me like that. Boom, send. You ever done that? I have. It didn't work out. Was it fruitful? Was it good for the relationship? No. And so again, what happens is this escalation can happen that quickly. We're living in an inflammatory age now, a very divided, bipolar, as I call it, opinions, right-wing, left-wing, and so on, to try and have a conversation about difficult issues, not provoking or triggering people, is increasingly challenging. And yet, we can turn on the TV and here's this person and they just love to sound off. They just love the sound of their own voices. They can't wait to express their latest opinion. It's incredible. I feel like I'm going upstream. I can feel like I'm not being powerful if I'm not expressing my point of view in the same way as these other powerful people who talk about empowerment all the time. Why is nobody talking about humility and self-control? It's just not in vogue. Even church board meetings can go the way of chaos. All it takes is one or two people at a meeting to just start sounding off in a heated way, and the quest for unity has just gone out the window. And Andy Warhol, the artist, said that in the time we live in, people will be famous for 15 minutes. And I think he meant that because a lot of us are starring at center stage in our lives. And what Tim Keller is saying, the more we're doing that, the more we are actually disabling ourselves from participating in the gift of self-control. I call it a gift because actually it's the way in terms of us finding healthier relationships and loving others. I think Tim Keller had it right. I think it's a matter of the heart. It's not just about sucking it up and saying, no, or willpower. It's linked to alertness so that we can pray and pray for others, and even others who we find difficult, bossy people who we find hard to deal with. It's a positive character attribute that I think is linked to patience. I needed a lot of patience at Shoppers Drug Mart a couple of weeks ago. I really did. And I don't have it naturally within myself. This virtue of self-control, I believe, helps us to please the Spirit of God instead of our own self-centered, sinful nature. And lastly, may I ask you this? When did you see Jesus show some self-control? Just think about that just for a second. When was a moment or a time in any of the stories in the Bible that he showed self-control? Well, I would say at the cross, first and foremost, if you want to read again all the things that he was accused of, taunted with, blasphemed against, this is the Son of God. It's absolutely incredible that he did not lose it and say, enough. Enough is enough. And come down and just sort them out right there and then. What was he exercising? Self-control of the highest order. Self-control has never been seen before in the world ever, and it's probably never been repeated. And I would argue as well, humility, and this is why I've chosen self-control first as the doorway into humility. It's kind of like a secret latch key, if you like, that opens that door to get us home. And the Bible's got lots to say, by the way, about boasting and being arrogant. I love this one in 1 Corinthians. For who makes you different from anyone else? Well, what do you have that you didn't receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not? Already you have all you want. Everything that you and I have has been received from God. And there's nothing really good in us that didn't come from him. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, pointed out that pride, which is the antithesis fighting against humility, pride is the worst of all sins. And there's two kinds. There's the outer pride and there's the inner pride. The inner pride is much harder to see. C.S. Lewis wrote very transparently about his struggle with pride. He was so crazy intelligent, so bright, that he'd go away after one of his talks and say, oh, what a clever chap I was there. I really felt I did a wonderful job answering that gentleman's question. And so on. And then how you slip into these places, it's just so insidious. I went back to Regent College to do my master's. I'm humbly realizing how much I have to learn. And there I am in a lecture, and I asked if I had any questions, and so I put up my hand and I asked the question. And then afterwards I'm going away saying, that was a clever question, wasn't it? And these sort of insidious ways you come into sort of self-congratulate yourself and put you back at the center. Or I want other people to look up at me for asking that brilliant question. What the heck is that about? That's pride, is what it's about. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity writes of pride as being the penultimate of all sins. You hear about all the list of 7, right, sins, but the one that puts them all in the same spool is pride. And to that he attaches conceit and arrogance. He says it's pride that's been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. And you can include today in the life that we're leading in this era. For a proud person has to be better than anyone else, and always has to be admired, looked up to, or seen as the best. According to Lewis, a humble person will strike you as a very cheerful, intelligent person who takes a real interest in what you said to him. And if you do dislike him, it could be because you feel a little envious of this person who seems to enjoy life so easily, who takes an interest in you rather than themselves first. That person probably isn't thinking about humility. He's mostly not thinking about himself at all. There's a great focus in the scriptures just over and over, not just focusing on ourselves first. In fact, I can't find a verse. This is very different than self-care, taking care of ourselves. That still needs to happen. But the scriptures over and over refer to others' interests. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others first. Christ himself is given as the high model of humility in Philippians. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. I wanted to give a personal example from my own family that really struck me as a big moment in humility. And it's with my brother Jeff. My brother Jeff was recently diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's a year before he turned 60 years old. He's now 2 years on his journey. He worked as a newscaster for 28 years for a television station. He did all the sports, and then he did all the morning news. He found he couldn't take the information in like he used to. He's having to use more cue cards, things like this that he could just say about this particular person or this sports person that were off the top of his head. He couldn't do anymore. He was losing control of his faculties. On the television station, just before he retired, given there's no family history, they asked him this question. Why do you think you got Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's? And my brother responded with these 3 words. He had an opportunity to sound off for about 3 to 4 minutes, by the way. He was on air. And he's very much admired for his work. And he said these 3 words. Why not me? Now, if you try and unpack what he's saying there, he's saying, just because I work for this TV station and I've done some good things in our community, I didn't deserve a life of special privilege. I'm not entitled in any way. I'm no different than anybody else. And we're in a fallen world, and there's still disease. Why not me? He said.